when the rocket was actually being put in place before, like 3 or 4 days before the launch. And his eyes were teary, and he says, I get to call this my job. We need to refocus our gaze in those who perhaps have not gotten the spotlight. And that's the kind of story I want to tell about the space station.
It's March 2020, and this is episode 45 of The Wow Signal, Among the Space People with Paola Castaño. For more information, please visit wowsignalpodcast.com. Hi, this is your host and producer, Paul Carr. My co-host for this episode, Daniela DePaulis, will be joining us shortly. In 2018, Daniela met Dr. Paola Castaño, and in that same year, Castaño published a scholarly article about Daniela's project Cogito, which we have discussed in depth on this podcast before, especially in episode 35. Now, Daniela wanted Paola on the Wow Signal to talk about her sociology research among science teams, especially teams preparing experiments for the International Space Station. Dr. Castaño is writing a book about this research, as we will discuss in the upcoming segment. Paola Castaño is a sociologist of science. She recently completed a Newton International Fellow funded by the British Academy at Cardiff University and is working on a book about the meanings and valuations of scientific research on the International Space Station. On the basis of ethnographic work following the life course of experiments sent to the station, her book examines the fields of particle physics, plant biology, and biomedical research. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago and has been a postdoctoral researcher at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the Free University of Berlin, and Waseda University in Tokyo. This interview was recorded over Zoom on the 28th of March, 2020. Dr. Castaño was in Wales, Daniela was in the Netherlands, and I was here in the Washington, D.C. suburbs.
Hi, Paul. Hi, Paola. Hi, everyone listening.
And our special guest is Paola Castaño. Hello, Paola.
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Now, you're at Cardiff now, right?
Near Cardiff.
Near Cardiff.
Yeah, I am in Llanelli, Wales.
Yes.
An hour and 15 minutes west of Cardiff.
Okay.
Well, I was a doctoral researcher as a Newton International Fellow. It's basically a postdoctoral position funded by the British Academy.
Okay.
An university, because they do a lot of science and technology studies, as we will talk about. That's kind of one of my main areas of research.
Okay. Now, I think what you and Daniela met a couple of years ago, or roughly, and Daniela thought your work was really interesting, and the first thing she showed me was this article about your work with the International Space Station. Now, you're a sociologist.
Indeed.
So what got you interested in working? First of all, give us a run up on who you are and how you got interested in that research.
Okay. So yes, I'm a sociologist. I guess that's kind of a first layer of my identity, with a background, kind of a broad background in social sciences. I did my undergraduate degree in political science and history back in Colombia, where I'm from, at the University of Los Andes. And my first class was a history of science class that absolutely inspired me and got me excited with this idea of understanding how science is a collective social endeavor, how meanings are collectively constructed. All these people who in the 1970s went to laboratories and did ethnographies. So a lot of these things inspired me a lot and shaped, I guess, to a large extent, how I became a social scientist. So with those 2 degrees, I went later to do my master's and my PhD at the University of Chicago, where I worked with amazing people and also got to expand my perspective on both the discipline of sociology of science in particular. I worked in a dissertation that has nothing to do with the international. I did some research about Colombia, again, where I'm from, in the context of reparations of victims of the armed conflict. Of my PhD, graduated, and decided a different topic for a series of reasons, most of them having to do with my convictions about how delicate the situation was and how the kind of contribution I thought I wanted to make as a researcher. So after long, difficult set of decisions, I moved on to the International Space Station, which at the time was something that I knew very little about. I was interested in this idea of such a large, interdependent, complex institution with so many countries, with so many meanings, with so many functions and promises across a variety of domains. And that till this day is the core of my interest on the space station. I've been very fortunate to be funded and to be able to travel to different parts of the world to do this research. My first position, and it's an institution that I will always be immensely grateful to, is the Smithsonian institution, the National Air and Space Museum. That was my first postdoc position. That was in 2015, where I got to meet the most amazing curators and historians of space who were absolutely generous and helped me, of course, shape my project more on the kind of history of space, of human space flight, which of course was something that I basically started from scratch learning as this project began. That was an amazing period where I did a lot of archival research at NASA headquarters, also at the Smithsonian, but also where I started becoming involved with the scientific community related to the International Space Station. And that's the thing where the project sort of came together for me. After that, I got to spend 15 months at the Free University of Berlin. And it was good to, of course, have a position in Europe that allowed me also to do a great deal of research and travel. Perhaps the 2 most important research opportunities I had in that context, and we can talk about them in more detail, was the chance to visit CERN and to meet with the alpha magnetic spectrometer team and with Samuel Ting, and to actually be in the operations room where they control the instrument. And second, and perhaps one of the most transforming experiences of my life, was to go to Baikonur, Kazakhstan, to see the launch of the MS-03 Soyuz rocket with 3 people on top going to the space station. And I put it in those very basic terms because sometimes people do forget the huge achievement that the fact that this has become a routine is. Anyway, just to finish the kind of little background, after that, I spent a month in Tokyo at Waseda University as a visiting fellow, just for a month, basically, to do a couple of very punctual sort of research visits related to the Japanese Space Agency, of course. And after that, I got the Newton Fellowship, which, of course, has been a luxury just to have the time to think through all this material, which at this point is almost 180 interviews, visits to 8 ground facilities associated with the space station, attending more than 25 conferences related to various aspects of the program, from the kind of large programmatic ones to like very specific ones related to the areas of science that I study. So yeah, and here I am, almost with 65% of a book manuscript that I hope will get published next year.
Oh, okay. Now,
what is the aspect of the International Space Station that you find most interesting to research as a sociologist?
Actually, I want to spend a bit of time on this question because that, in fact, has been the most difficult thing for me to figure out as a researcher. And I think at the same time is both what's magnificent, but what makes the program extremely problematic, which is the fact that it tries to do many things across domains. So the space station is a political institution that, of course, is a result of an agreement between, the countries that participate. So it's kind of an instrument of foreign policy. The largest, of course, cooperation, political cooperation, at that level. It's an engineering achievement. I mean, the fact that this is the largest human-made object, that of course is also outside the planet, and that it has to sustain life for more than 20 years. But it's also a test bed for technology, for space, for commercialization. It's an educational platform that has to inspire kids to become scientists and engineers. And on top of all that is a laboratory. And it's not a laboratory that's specialized in a particular field. It's not a laboratory where the people conducting the experiments are the biologist or the physicist. It's a laboratory where you have technicians by delegation, and that's a huge aspect of the space station, of the complexity of the program, that have to perform experiments across domains. And this is what astronauts have to do. So in one day, they can dissect a mouse for tissue experiment. They water the plants in the veggie facility. They fix the toilet. They talk and inspire the kids in a school. They take samples of themselves, of course, that they have to process in particular ways. So you have these like multitaskers. Astronauts have to perform scientific activities across all those many domains. So in fact, the core of my attention is this multifunctionality, is how that makes up a very uniquely complex institution, but also how that can help us shed light on the nature of social institutions here on Earth.
Now, do you mean the multifunctionality of the individuals involved, or?
Both of the institution, exactly, and the individuals involved.
Okay.
So again, that the space station is political, commercial, scientific, educational, technological, but at the same time, the astronauts themselves as individuals have to perform activities in all those very different domains. Mm-hmm. So then what it takes is a great amount of coordination. And that coordination is the actual ultimate achievement of the International Space Station. And it's sometimes what it's taken for granted. And why is it taken for granted? I think it has a lot to do with our ideas of science, our ideas that science is only valuable because of the big breakthrough, of the big kind of shiny achievement. I always contrast, the space station wished, or at least some of the people on the program wished they had a moment like, the Higgs boson. Here it is, we found it. Or the moment when the black hole image is unveiled, like this one image, this one moment of discovery, the spectacle of discovery that somehow summarizes a great amount of research, a great amount of people's lives and expertise put together. The space station hasn't had that one single moment. And for some people, that's perceived as a deficit of the program. It's the most expensive, the most complex, effort of this sort. Where's the scientific payoff of the space station? Some people ask. And the answer to that question cannot be framed in the same way as those other, examples with which I'm contrasting it. The achievement of the space station, it's its daily operations, it's its coordination. And if we're attuned to looking at institutions that way, we can actually think back on different ways of valuing and different ways of evaluating what this program is about. Because again, what I'm studying is very, very tied not only to the process of doing science, but how science is evaluated by different stakeholders with very different ideas and very different perspectives of what the space station is and ought to be. So the multifunctionality also has a lot to do with valuation and assessments of value of the program.
So what is the result of this highly coordinated society, micro-society, micronation, whatever we want to call it, like the ISS? While listening to you, I was thinking, isn't also the possibility of having humans orbiting the planet on a steady base already a huge achievement for humankind?
Yeah, exactly. So I think part of the effort of my book is to change the question. What is the outcome, or what is the big success, and what's there's a great deal of terminology. The killer app. In the US they use a lot of like the bang for the buck. Like there's all this terminology that is very, very outcome oriented. And everything that only focuses on outcome is not honoring the process, is not really having the time to think about how the process itself is the achievement. That's what I'm trying to argue. And I try to show it, I begin by saying, of course, the iconic imagery that is associated with the space station, rocket launches, this huge, astronauts conducting daring maneuvers in space, scientific discovery. Well, that's where the wrong emphasis, in a way, from a sociological perspective, where the wrong emphasis is placed. We need to look at the daily achievement of operations. For me, it's equally marvelous that, for instance, the contractors from the SpaceX vehicles that return with samples have to stop every 15 minutes along the road to check the temperature of the sample that they're returning to all these various laboratories. That the fact to hold water in the vessels that are attached to the veggie hardware on the space station came up as a result of a very artisanal intervention by a lab technician who thought that putting gauze around one of the buckets, one of the areas of the plant would allow for it to hold water a lot more. Like, these are the stories that are usually not associated with the big imagery of the space station. And this is where sociologists have tuned their gaze towards. Now, where a lot of people are naming those who are working in supermarkets, those who are cleaning. We're recording this in a very difficult moment, I think, for humankind, which is we're all in this pandemic moment. And there's a terminology called the key worker. And now, for a lot of people, for us as sociologists, that's our automatic pilot. We know society is interdependent. We know the opera is as much the result of the artists who are on stage than the people who clean the theater afterwards. And this is exactly the story I'm trying to tell about the space station. Fortunately, now more people will be attuned to that way of thinking and seeing things, as we were seeing the great, value of work that sometimes comes completely, that is sometimes even ignored. This is what makes up the space station stories like that. Stories of someone making a last minute change on an instrument to make it last longer. The fact that, for instance, one of the tools that was used to repair the alpha magnetic spectrometer, the most expensive, almost dramatic instrument, sent to the space station because it required a huge political process, it required congressional legislation, etc. One of the tools used in the repair was a result of a call that was issued by NASA, where a team of students actually put together the tool. And these are the stories that make the space station absolutely fantastic. And these are the things that, again, more than the rocket launch and the daring maneuver in the spacewalk, these are the things that if we look at them carefully enough, we will find and we will confirm the unbelievable achievement that having people living and working in space, something that almost becomes a slogan, that is actually when that becomes sociologically, you give, flesh and blood to that slogan.
Tell us a little bit about your working method when you're working with people at NASA or wherever you're, Kazakhstan. How do you go about gathering your data?
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because the kind of iconic, I would say, form of studying scientific practice in my field has been to conduct an ethnography of a laboratory. So there are some big figures in my field that basically in the 1970s decided to go into laboratories, and ethnography is basically participant observation. And they, as a social scientist, as an anthropologist, as a sociologist, these people went into laboratories and started looking at how people go about making experiments, how science happens in these places. Of course, when it comes to the space station, that's a complicated question, right? Where is the lab? Is the lab up there? Is the lab only in the analog version of the ground lab of the PI of the experiment that's up there? Is it also in the person who's transporting the goods? Is it also in the payload integration? So the laboratory on the space station becomes this very extended kind of set of sites that are distributed. So with that premise, I started following, not only going, of course, to the ground facilities associated with the experiments, but also, for instance, going to conferences and going to meetings where researchers defend in a way or present or justify their science in order to guarantee funding. So that's kind of how I started moving around and meeting people. So I attended a lot of conferences, and this is actually where I've come to meet both people, in the directive positions of the program, but also scientists. And I sit with them and I interview them. In the social sciences, we have basically ethics protocols. So we have to always let people know what is the purpose of the interview, how we're going to use them. In some cases, of course, we show people the final product or the excerpts that we're going to use for the publication. And people have been really interested. And this is what has been a beautiful experience. There's a generosity of people on all levels of the program telling me their stories, telling me, I mean, when it comes to the space station, everyone is somehow living their dream, which is also an inspiring and beautiful thing to witness, right? When you sit in front of a botanist who thinks about gravitropism, and that has been his entire career, and now has a chance to send plants to space, and is able to fund PhD students and postdocs. It's a group of people, it's a community that has come together as a result of having this facility and this possibility there. Same for a lot of people directing the program. I mean, until, well, I guess last summer, Bill Gerstenmaier was the director of human spaceflight at NASA. And I remember vividly standing next to him in the Gagarin launch pad in Baikonur when the rocket was actually being put in place before, like 3 or 4 days before the launch. And his eyes were teary, and he says, I get to call this my job. There's something about the space station where a lot of people has that moment, like, I get to do this for a living, isn't it? And sometimes, of course, it's bureaucratic. It's a lot of delays. There's, of course, as in any program, there are, of course, politics in terms of which experiments get prioritized over. But there's a level at which everyone seems to have this, like, whoa, we get to do this. And that, I think, it's been a beautiful encounter to just sit down with, as I said, 180 people or more. I mean, at this point, I think I lost count, actually, because I did a couple of interviews last month, and kind of get that experience from each one of them in their own little corner of the program. And this is exactly how the whole picture comes together, through many little corners. Then also, of course, going to ground facilities. So as I said, I went to CERN. I've been to the Kennedy Space Center with the teams who work with the veggie experiment in plant biology. And I go every year to Galveston to the human research program, where all the medical researchers come. So I've visited a couple of them in their universities. And there I do, of course, a lot of my interviews. And a third part of my research, so, ethnography, which is participant observation, interviews, but then there's also archival research. And the NASA archive, every day I went there, just felt like Christmas. They had 190 boxes labeled space station. And mind you, I'm a foreign national. So foreign nationals are only allowed to be in NASA facilities with a lot of restrictions. And everybody is, of course, has to follow the rules. I'd happily follow the rules. Everybody's really nice as they're following the rules. And I will always be grateful to the archivist who arrived an hour before and left an hour earlier, so I could stretch my days as much as I could to actually do as much research going over the huge amount of material that was there. So, and I've done that research in NASA and the European Space Agency archives that are in Florence, and the Japanese Space Agency archives in Tsukuba. So those have been some of the archival research and undertakings related to my method of gathering data.
So is this coordination of the space station something that you think we should be replicating here on Earth, or what could be replicated, why, or do you think it's a unique experiment that works because it is isolated from the rest of all kind of social, economic situations we have on Earth?
Well, I think it's actually nothing but societal interdependence, kind of in a condensed version, right? The fact that the space station has to sustain the whole of life, that people have to eat, sleep, exercise, do work, talk, reflect, just follow the rules. Like, this is exactly what social life is. So in a way, I think the space station, is not replicating the space station experiment on Earth. It's kind of seeing a lot of the interdependencies and coordinations that enable life on Earth being kind of displayed in a very, as I said, concentrated form on the space station. But also a second aspect of that question is the fact that the program itself, because it has the multiple pressures it has, of course, and then there's an accountability of the program in terms of the results, and there are all these efforts to curate, the big research findings, the benefits for humanity. I mean, the program produces all these documents. None of these documents, in fact, reflect or grasp the learning process of all the people involved in coordinating their work. I was set to attend the Payload Operations Integration Workshop at NASA Marshall this April next April, which, by the way, has been a huge drama because of all, again, the permissions and aspects. And finally, I had the possibility and the authorization to go. And well, of course, now this happens. But basically, this is where a lot of people, talk about their experience as payload operators, as writing procedures for astronauts. And all of this somehow gets lost. I said, it's amazing for me to be able to be there and to document how you, with your different, levels and experiences, come together and share that experience. But that seems to get lost because, of course, we're not thinking about this all the time. This is, again, the job of sociologists, right? How does societal, coordination happens? And sometimes people are just going about it. Sometimes certain situations put these things to the fore. And I think that's one of the things I was hoping to do, to kind of observe that, because I think the program itself has left that unexamined because of its own, as I said, pressures and promises and concerns. I said, is someone registering what happens in those meetings beyond, like the minutes or the, how you reflect, how you learn, how you pass information on to others, that how the know-how of operating experiments in space. How are you going to learn that? How are you going to pass that information on to other people? That's not very clear because they're just too busy doing what they're doing.
Now, the space station will be up there at least a few more years, possibly quite a bit longer, depending on whom you ask. But do you think it would be of value to have an anthropologist or sociologist on the space station?
My colleagues from the ISS Archaeology Project will very strongly say yes. In fact, they're Justin Walsh and Alice Gorman. He's a professor at Chapman University in the US, and Alice is a very well-known space archaeologist based in Australia. And for Justin, what inspired him to begin this project with the ISS was NASA's call for astronauts, where, of course, the fields of expertise that are required are STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And he basically he has a very strong conviction that you need to have social scientists up there. I personally would not want to go to the International Space Station. In fact, if I'm able to study this in a way, like there's a part of me that really cannot believe that there are people who are willing to go to space and go through all the hardships that they have to go there. So again, that's not the standpoint from which I'm approaching this. But there's this idea that, of course, there's a certain set of technical skills that only people with a STEM background can have that social scientists cannot have. I disagree with that. I mean, I think you need people with different ways of looking at the world, and we need to enable better conversations between the scientific and technological and engineering fields and the social sciences, more broadly speaking. Because again, if what you're going to have is sustaining social life, you need to have critical, reflexive perspectives about it. And those are the ones that we can offer as social scientists. As I said, not necessarily going there, at least from my perspective, but some people think that NASA and the space agencies are still too narrow-minded in terms of what they consider the crucial expertise to go to space.
Do you have the opportunity to share your work with the astronauts, like your considerations? Like when you said earlier, you think that the main achievement of the space station is this incredible coordination on a daily basis. Do you think the astronauts would agree with you?
I think so. Actually, I have interviewed a few astronauts, but not too many of them. To be honest, and of course, being very respectful, my sense is that active astronauts will still give you a very kind of scripted perspective of what the program is about. Very few of them open up about glitches, about mistakes, which of course are the wonderful, fascinating things that are of interest for me. In that case, the scientists and the payload operators are a lot more open about that. I think astronauts, of course, carry a huge duty in terms of representing the program in its best, appearance before different audiences. So, but I have said this to my main interlocutors, which are, again, program people at the, directing level of the program and scientists, and they agree with me. And actually, it's been really interesting because one time I gave a talk at NASA headquarters, was in 2017, And there were some major kind of representatives of the program. And they looked at me and said, it's the first time we hear a social scientist not like being imprecise or generic about things. Like you get this stuff. And it's great what you're saying, but hey, we still need to go to Congress and we still need to answer to those guys who are, again, sitting there waiting for the big shiny outcome. Your sociological answer is, of course, very interested, but is not going to be the same answer we can give because we're still under the pressure of delivering an outcome. And for the scientists, of course, for them is more on a different level, I think. And it to me is fascinating how the conversations happen again between a sociologist and, for instance, a particle physicist. And I remember vividly the day I spent in doing interviews at CERN with the AMS team. And they were like, remember, she's a sociologist. She doesn't understand a lot of the positrons and, whatever antimatter stuff that we're studying. And I said, no, wait a minute. At that time, they had published only 3 papers in Physical Review Letters. And I said, no, let me actually tell you how I read your stuff and you tell me if I'm wrong. And actually, that's a moment when they kind of looked at me with a different degree of respect and said, oh, okay, you know what we're studying here. And I said, well, yeah, it's not the level of which I'm going to engage with your work in my paper. But having said that, tell me about some of the problems you've had. And that's a moment when they actually opened up about a lot of the issues they have. A lot of course, it's a instrument and an experiment that, of course, has given high precision data that is open to different theoretical interpretations. And it was in one moment when I had a window into the reflections about the uncertainty, basically, that this big scientific instrument will kind of, remain. And it's one of the biggest puzzles, of course, of science, dark matter, antimatter. But I think those are moments, again, when my very processual, very attentive to the detail has enabled fantastic conversations with a scientist where it has resonated with the people who run the program. And as I said, with astronauts, I have not really had that kind of back and forth interaction. So, yeah.
Do you have any new insights to offer us now that you've done all this work about how science really happens in the real world with all the messy, dirty work that goes on?
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it. I think that's the beauty of it, that it is made by humans, that it is made by passionate humans that do make mistakes all the time. And again, that's also the nature of the scientific method and of science as a practice, right? You learn something by not getting it right the first time, or the fact that you think you probably got it right is always object to, different, and it's always up to correction, right? It's not the final point about anything. To me, what has been, and it is a focus of my chapter about the veggie experiment, about the experiment that they grow lettuce and other plants on the space station, is the fact that the technicians on the space station are technicians by delegation, in a way that all the things, all the know-how, all the kind of bodily, sensorial, automatic pilot that sometimes researchers have in their labs, when it comes to the space station, has to be made absolutely explicit, step by step. Like the word pen is labeled on the pen, and that thing goes in a little pouch. And that thing has to go in a little pouch next to the scissors that are labeled scissors. And that person, and the 3 minutes that it takes to retrieve that instrument to make a cut, and the amount of centimeters between the root of the plant and the leaf to make that cut is actually written in a procedure. I find that just stunning. It's fantastic. And for scientists, it's really difficult because they just simply know how to do this stuff. And they either train their students or they train their laboratory technicians, but they're all in the same space doing that stuff. Here comes the heroes, as I call it, the people at Marshall Space Flight Center, or people who write procedures for astronauts, who have a great amount of expertise in terms of making the implicit explicit. So it's very interesting because on the one hand, the big kind of discovery of people doing laboratory ethnographies in the 1970s, the people that I've read and that I've learned from in my career, they all talked about tacit knowledge, this know-how, this thing that you simply know how to do it, but you just cannot really articulate how it's done. The most obvious example is riding a bicycle. I said, no. What you have on the space station is that expertise is actually relational. In other words, it's the result of this relationship between the different pieces that people know, what allows for a procedure to exist in order for an astronaut to execute it, without assuming that the astronaut is an expert, is a botanist, or is a physicist in whatever the field they have to perform the experiment. They even use a term, and I don't know how open the use of that term is, but I mean, it's called pseudonaut, which is basically how they test the fact that a procedure is clearly written, that any person with a basic kind of comprehension can just read the procedure and follow the task without assuming that that person has any kind of, as I said, PhD or master's or degree in the area. So that for me has been a really interesting insight in terms of, again, how expertise works on the space station, but also a big contrast with a lot of the things that in my field people kind of take for granted, which is this idea of tacit knowledge. And the delegation moment of taking science to the space station implies, again, this big coordination that I've been talking about. And there are, of course, two other aspects that make science on the space station quite unique. And one is miniaturization. Some researchers will colloquially say we have to fit our lab in a shoebox, which is precisely kind of, the size of a payload, of the time that an astronaut can spend performing or, fiddling with things. So you have miniaturization, you have delegation, but you also have deferral. So what happens when you're in a lab? You tinker with stuff. Oh, that didn't work out. Okay, let's change this. Let's try it again. We'll try it tomorrow morning, or we'll try it today. No, on the space station, it could be months before an experiment or a payload can be transformed in order to do another version of the experiment. And also, of course, in the case of experiments that require samples to come back, it takes, whenever the next cargo vehicle returning samples. So it just basically makes what we consider as a scientific process that happens on Earth, it breaks it apart in all these in these three different processes that are the ones that I discuss, also finding, as I said, very different things from what we sometimes take for granted about how science works on Earth. But science is messy everywhere.
Did you get a chance to interview? You said you haven't interviewed that many astronauts yet. Did you?
Yes.
So I was going to ask you if you'd interviewed any that are MDs, but I'm not sure you have yet.
They're kind of flight surgeons.
Yeah, they're not up there all the time, but
yeah. Well, it's one of my most amazing research sites, and I've been 5 years in a row, is the Human Research Program Researchers Workshop, Investigators Workshop. So basically they have a clinical session where basically a lot of the flight surgeons, of course, there's a lot of confidentiality issues there.
Sure.
And I think, but it's one of those interesting moments when, of course, clinical findings are rendered. Of course, they have to be anonymized for the scientific community to come to speed with things. Mm-hmm. Perhaps the most salient case is now called SANS, the visual problems that astronauts have had. So, of course, this is a clinical finding that has become a research program. And, of course, is a risk that the program has labeled as such and has, recruited scientists to study. So, no, it's only been in those contexts. The one experiment in which I've interviewed all PIs was a twins investigation, the Kelly twins. So I followed that experiment from the beginning until publication about a year ago. And I've interviewed all researchers in that experiment. And for instance, they keep telling me it would have been so nice if we would have had more data from the clinical side, but we can't have access to that data. I mean, NASA, of course, divides what is part of just simply, dealing with the astronaut health, as any physician will do, respecting privacy, versus what's considered research, where of course are also anonymized, but with different aims.
Is part of your research also looking at how people on Earth perceive the space station? So the public, how does the public
yes,
this huge experiment?
Yes. So I have a chapter that is about assessments of value of the space station. And I look at three. So public is of course a bit of a general term, and I try to, it can become very fuzzy as an object of inquiry. So what I have is three different kinds of publics. So I have political stakeholders. So I have a lot of recorded, and of course this is public, of course, when the Science and Technology Subcommittee calls people from the space station program and, basically ask them and, to provide some kind of accounting of what the program has achieved or whatever is going on. So that's one aspect, political stakeholders, that's one public. The other public is scientific communities. And that's also kind of broad, but I focus particularly on the National Academy of Sciences in the US, where I've done also some observations and a lot of interviews, and I look at their decadal surveys, and I look at their space weeks and the different events where this community comes together. And third, I have media representations of the space station, which in a way you could say shape a lot of the public perception of the ISS. And what I find in all three context, well, in the second one is a bit different because scientists are, again, depending on which field, but particularly in the first, in the political context and in the media context, again, is this outcome, this thirst for like a big outcome, and this clumsiness in representing results that are not the pristine, shiny, one headline kind of thing, and being very clumsy in their presentation. So for instance, when the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer collaboration published their first paper, there were a lot of headlines saying they discovered dark matter, which, by the way, is something that cannot happen that way. You know, they found a certain excess of positrons within a certain ranges of energy. Half of the audience will fall asleep. Well, why do you assume half of the audience will fall asleep? Like, how come? What's the responsibility of media in explaining that some scientific experiments are complex and they don't have, you know, results that can be summarized in a headline? Another example is the Kelly study, where the twins, you know, Scott Kelly, who spent a year on the space station, he came back with 7% of his DNA changed. Like, you know, 7% of his DNA changed as a result of being in space for a year, which was, by the way, also a mistake because there was an issue. They issued a press release without having the published paper, which is, again, is this thirst to have some kind of headline, right? And the journalists kind of pick up something that sounds salient or flamboyant, and 7% of your DNA, first, you're no longer a human, but it's, of course, gene expression in a particular context that, again, all of these things need context and are not this single headline thing. And it's the same. What is the big discovery of the space station? And of course, when you have people like who have been running the scientific portfolio of the space station, they will never be able to give a single answer to that because they have multiple experiments running at the same time with different thresholds of discovery. So whenever you have your senator or your representative sitting there interviewing, you know, interrogating, which, by the way, is a kind of very adversarial type of interaction. Okay, space station, show me the results. Where's the bang for the buck? The answer will always be a list of things that, if what you expect is a single bang, is always going to look clumsy and insufficient. But again, the problem is with how the question is formulated, is with where the expectation is placed. And I'm not going to say this is only, of course, the fault, quote unquote, of these publics. It has a lot to do with how the program justified its existence. And my first chapter, which is basically the history of the space station program and its justification, is called the Pyrotechnics of Promise, because this is precisely what the space station did. It just basically oversold its promises to as many constituencies as possible to justify, you know, the fact of having such a large platform. So it has to promise to do many things for many different people.
Right.
And that, of course, is how the space station has to spread itself very thin across all those different domains to be able to simultaneously, again, we go back to the multifunctionality idea. So, of course, there's a big responsibility in terms of how the program presented itself. And for instance, how the program itself presents its own numbers. When you compare the number of papers published by the Hubble Space Telescope with the space station, that's it's the wrong comparison, because the nature and the process of scientific research is very different than the two platforms. I mean, sure. Hubble, publishes over 10,000 papers about 5 years ago is when I last checked. You know, CERN, like, how do you compare facilities that are entirely dedicated to a field of science where the actual, you know, where people are the entire time focused on that research, versus something like the space station, where, by the way, your scientific technician has to fix the toilet, where that person cannot take a shower in 6 months, where they're isolated, where they're dealing with many other things, where, you know, from retrieving the payload, they have to go and talk to a school and inspire the children to become the engineers of tomorrow. the content, the context, the texture of that practice is very different. And this is again when numbers and accounting and pyrotechnics of promise don't do justice to the process itself.
Okay, now I understand you just told us a little while ago you're working on a new book, which we hope will be out in a few months, maybe.
Well, so yeah, it depends. I was actually part of my trip to the U.S. in April was actually to go to University of Chicago Press, where I hope it will be published. So it is a result of this research. So the book title, is a tentative title, is Beyond the Lab: The Social Life of Experiments on the International Space Station. Mm-hmm. So this is what I've been working and thinking and dreaming about for the past 5 years since I started the project, and I hope people can read it as a book.
Is this a scholarly book or a more popular book?
I think it's a scholarly book. Yeah, it's somewhere. I'm a kind of scholar that I'm not very wordy. I like to write for people who, I like to make my reading accessible, particularly also to the people about whose work I'm writing. And I mentioned, for instance, recently I published this piece about Daniela and her collaboration, Cogito in Space. And before I published it, I wanted them to read it, and I wanted it to make sense to them. And I think I care about my book being pertinent for the people that I'm studying in this context, of course, for the scientists and for the space station program people. So I hope on that level it is accessible. And what I've shown so far to people involved in the program, and it's a response I love, which is you really get this. Like, you get that it's difficult, you get that it's complicated, that it's not easy, that we cannot do everything at the same time. And if I'm able to convey that to those who have given me their words and their time in the past few years, telling me about their work on the space station, I feel like I've accomplished something. So I hope that shows in the final product next year.
Well, we've held you about an hour here, so I appreciate your time. Is there anything else, any final remarks you'd like to make before we wrap it up?
No, that I think, the moment that we're living in is going to show us that societies are complex, interdependent arrangements, right? And that perhaps the things that we overlook are the things that sustain life. Again, as I said, the little jobs here and there, little and big quotation marks, now they're being called key workers. And in a way, this is both, I think, a sociological point, but I think it's also a political belief, right? We need to refocus our gaze in those who perhaps have not gotten the spotlight. And that's the kind of story I want to tell about the space station. And I hope it resonates a lot with the reflections that we'll spend decades, I think, elaborating of this moment that we're living with the pandemic of the COVID-19. So,
well, that's wonderful way to wrap it up. I have nothing to add. What about you, Daniela?
Well, we'll have Paola Castaño again soon, hopefully, for telling us a little more about her experience with many aspects of space. So I think today we only covered one section of her large research. And also, I'm very proud to say that Paola is a honorary collaborator of a lot of my projects. And we exchange always ideas about ongoing works. And we really share these, I think, appreciation for the process and the mutual trust in sharing with each other. The process is very important because it's a privilege that you can only share with a few people, I think.
No, thank you, Daniela.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. And we hope to touch base with you again someday soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Well, thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye, Daniela.
Paola.
Oh, okay.
Bye,
thank you.
Paul.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good evening. Thank you so much again. Bye.
Bye.
Well, thanks, Paola and Daniela. We'll look forward to a follow-up when Paola's book comes out. this conversation was an eye-opener for me, since I had no idea anyone was doing research like Paolas. And now it seems to me we need a better understanding of how science and technical teams work for future missions to Mars and beyond, because work like this can help us form the insights we need to keep these micro-societies functional and robust. Or at least those are my initial naive thoughts. Of course, your thoughts and ideas are welcome here. There are lots of ways to get in touch with us. Our email address is wowsignalpodcast@gmail.com, and on Twitter, we're @podcastwow. We have a Discord server, a Facebook page, and a subreddit as well. See our blog at wowsignalpodcast.com for all the information you need, as well as information about how you can support the podcast and, of course, where to buy t-shirts with the podcast logo. A couple of little housekeeping announcements. If you were a listener to the Unseen podcast, soon the podcast feed will be taken down. However, all the old episodes are available on YouTube, and as far as we know, this is in perpetuity. We'll also leave the old unseenpodcast.com blog up as long as Google will let us. The Wow Signal Pub number 2 is planned for April 17th at 2100 Eastern Daylight Time. You are encouraged to participate. There is no agenda, no plan, no real host, no show notes, but it will all go on your permanent record. If we get enough participation, we'll do these more often. If you want to participate, check out the link to the Zoom meeting on our Twitter feed or the blog at wowsignalpodcast.com. I'll also post it on Discord at least one day in advance. We'll be streaming live to YouTube. A Wow Signal live show is planned for May 25th. This will probably be sometime in the afternoon on the U.S. East Coast. Anyone with a keen interest in the life and work of Douglas Adams who wants to be on the panel should contact me sooner rather than later. The email address is, again, wowsignalpodcast@gmail.com. That's it for the Wow Signal, episode 45. I would encourage you to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast aggregation service and give us a rating and review as well. The Creative Commons and public domain music for this episode is by DJ Spooky, Blue Dot Sessions, Lee Mediford, and Lloyd Rogers. The Wow Signal was released under the Creative Commons Attribution License. For more information, please visit wowsignalpodcast.com.